You're not going to believe how fast this situation exploded or how quickly one woman went from, "I make the rules," to "rules still apply to you." And the wildest part? It all started in the most ordinary way possible, on a warm, calm Saturday morning where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen. The parking lot outside the neighborhood shopping plaza was full of normal weekend life. Toddlers balancing giant ice cream cones, parents trying to sip coffee before it cooled, couples strolling out of the bakery holding fresh pastries, and the usual Saturday crowd shuffling in and out of shops. The kind of morning where people talk slowly, smile politely, and expect absolutely zero conflict. But then she arrived. Locals already knew her reputation. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't a celebrity. She was something far more feared in this particular neighborhood. A board member of the HOA, the same HOA that sent warning letters over garden flags being too festive, and fined a man because his trash can was visible for 9 extra minutes after pickup. She was the type of person who treated tiny rules like sacred law, except when she was the one inconvenienced. She had a clipboard personality with a queen of the subdivision ego, the kind of woman who believed her driveway was a throne and everyone else's yard was a project she'd been personally assigned to criticize. And just like she carried herself at HOA meetings, she pulled into that plaza like she owned not just the parking lot, but the entire state. Her shiny luxury SUV glided right past 3 open regular parking spaces. She didn't even hesitate. She drove straight into the single disabled parking spot closest to the storefront. Bright blue paint, wheelchair icon freshly retouched, and a clearly posted sign that could not be missed unless someone closed their eyes on purpose. She didn't have a placard. She didn't have a permit. She didn't even glance at the sign. She just parked, grabbed her purse, and stepped onto the pavement like she was stepping onto a red carpet laid out exclusively for her. People noticed immediately, eyes turned, heads tilted. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A dad standing by the bike rack looked over at a woman next to him and raised his eyebrows. A couple sitting outside the cafe exchanged, "Is this really happening?" looks. Someone standing near the grocery cart return pulled out their phone, not because they wanted drama, but because they already knew exactly how this was going to go. They'd seen her before. And every single witness had almost the same internal reaction, word for word. "Oh no. She's not really doing this, right? Oh, but she was." And she wasn't just doing it, she was owning it. She strode toward the store doors with that unmistakable air of, "I'm important enough to ignore the rules." The same rules she wrote long emails to other people about. The exact rules she used to shame homeowners in board meetings. The irony floated over the parking lot like a neon sign. Some people think entitlement is loud. But real entitlement isn't loud, it's casual. It's effortless. It's the way she didn't even look around to check if anyone was watching, because in her mind, watching didn't matter. She'd gotten so used to people backing down from her in the HOA that she assumed the entire world operated like that too. The funniest part? You could see the moment where the crowd mentally clocked who she was. It was like synchronized recognition. Oh, it's her. Everyone in town had at least heard of her. The woman who scolded someone for hanging wind chimes because they were visually distracting. The woman who once threatened to fine a family for chalk drawings on their own driveway because she considered them unapproved exterior. Art. The woman who showed up uninvited to a neighbor's barbecue just to say the grill was too close to the fence. And now here she was, breaking a rule so big, so obvious, so universally understood that even 5-year-olds know better. You could almost feel gravity tilt. The first person who spoke up didn't yell. He didn't confront her aggressively. He just politely said, "Ma'am, this is a disabled parking space. Are you sure you can park there?" She didn't even slow down, didn't turn her head, didn't apologize. She tossed out a short, dismissive, "I'll only be a minute," like a queen waving off a servant. But it wasn't the words. It was the tone. The tone said, "This rule is for other people, not me." She had no idea people were already recording. She had no idea that parking spot wasn't just painted blue. It was about to be the stage where her ego would publicly trip over itself. She had no idea that her little "I'll only be a minute" moment was about to spiral into internet history. If she had parked illegally in an ordinary space, maybe people would have rolled their eyes and gone back to their lattes. But disabled parking spots aren't just spots. They're a lifeline, they're proximity for those who physically can't. Walk half a block to the door. Their access, their dignity, and she treated it like VIP parking for her. Smoothie run. By the time she stepped inside the store, 2 more people had started filming. Not because they were looking for clout, because they already knew there was no chance she was actually only a minute. People like her never are. The world has watched that pattern 1,000 times. I'll only be a minute magically becomes as long as I feel like it. 5 minutes turn to 10, then 15, then 20. Entitlement doesn't run on clocks. It runs on assumption. The longer she was gone, the faster irritation began to replace disbelief. A disabled driver pulled into the plaza, circled twice, and had nowhere to park. They had to stop in a loading zone and wait. That was the moment when the situation went from, "Ugh, seriously?" to "This is unacceptable." People looked again at the SUV, at the empty driver's seat, at the missing placard, at the bright blue paint screaming "No excuse." That's when someone said, "Call it in," not yelled. Not angry, just firm. Because a rule ignored is one thing, but a rule that directly blocks someone else's needs, that's where patience ends. While she was strolling aisle to aisle with no awareness of what was building outside, a quiet social storm was already spinning up. A phone call went out. A patrol car was dispatched, and in the exact moment she believed she was getting away with something small, she was actually walking straight into something much bigger than she realized. She wasn't just going to get caught, she was going to get caught publicly, by a community tired of her double standards. And the cameras? They weren't going anywhere. She had no idea yet. But that blue parking spot was about to be the most expensive 30 feet of asphalt she had ever stood on. She had no idea she was seconds away from losing not just a parking spot, but her reputation as the person who knew all the rules. She had no idea she was about to become the star of her own viral meltdown. She thought she walked into a store for a smoothie. She actually walked straight into karma. The moment she turned around and snapped at that first man, you could feel the shift in the air. Not just irritation and something heavier. Entitlement so thick you could practically see it settle onto the pavement like a fog. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't, "Oh, I didn't realize." It was deliberate. Confident. Performed with the posture of someone who had gotten her way so many times that being questioned felt insulting to her. The man who tried to warn her didn't argue back. He just blinked, taken aback, like he had just watched someone brag about stealing traffic cones as if it were noble community service. She had delivered that line. "I'm on the HOA board. I know the rules." As if she believed the HOA was a branch of federal government and she was holding diplomatic immunity. But the most revealing part wasn't the words. It was her face. She gave him a stare that said, "I outrank you." The kind of look people use when they expect others to shrink. The kind of look that only works on people afraid of confrontation. Except today, nobody shrank. People just watched, and kept watching. When she tossed out her second excuse, "There are plenty of other spots. Go park somewhere else if you don't like it." The tone wasn't impatience. It was ownership. As if she believed the spot belonged to her, and anyone criticizing her was merely trespassing in an argument she believed she had already won. She didn't see a disabled symbol painted on the asphalt. She saw convenience. She didn't see a regulation. She saw a shortcut. She didn't see the needs of others. She saw her own comfort, magnified larger than everyone else's existence. And then she vanished inside the store. She didn't rush. She didn't power walk. She strolled, casual, comfortable, zero shame, zero consideration. Not even a sideways glance back at the vehicle she'd just dumped in a spot reserved by law. Minutes ticked by. The onlookers expected her to come back quickly because surely, she would keep her word about a minute. But after 5 minutes, she was still inside. 10 minutes, 12, 15. The same people who had witnessed her entitlement were now watching the slow unfurling of consequence begin to stir around her. The SUV sat there like a monument to hypocrisy. Someone murmured, "Is she really not coming back?" A woman holding a stroller said softly, "Of course she's not. People like that never just run in. They say that so you won't challenge them." The longer the vehicle sat there, the more people noticed it. And the more they noticed, the harder it became to ignore the symbolism. A person with power taking something away from someone without it. Not physically, not violently, just selfishly. At around the 20-minute mark, a disabled driver pulled into the lot. It was immediately obvious they needed that space. Their car moved slowly, like every step between the lot and the entrance mattered. They circled once, twice, 3 times, no space. Not for them. The woman who needed that spot couldn't get out, not because of traffic, not because the lot was full, but because someone decided her smoothie was more important than another person's legs. That's when the quiet frustration in the crowd hardened into resolve. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about fairness. Nobody yelled. Nobody insulted her. Nobody marched into the store to drag her back out. That's the difference between anger and accountability. Anger demands a scene. Accountability documents one. And documenting was exactly what people were already doing. Phones weren't being held at chest height anymore. They were raised. Angles were framed. Timestamps were recorded. The SUV became Exhibit A. The missing placard became Exhibit B. The waiting disabled driver became Exhibit C, proof of harm. It was no longer hers to narrate. It was evidence. That's when someone dialed. The call wasn't heated. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple and firm. There's a vehicle illegally parked in a disabled space with no permit. The driver is inside the store and refuses to move. There is a disabled motorist waiting. That was all it took. The words alone carried enough weight. People sometimes think justice is loud, a gavel, a siren, a confrontation, but most of the time, justice starts quietly. With someone saying, "This is wrong and I am not pretending it isn't." The disabled driver parked temporarily out of the way and waited. They didn't complain. They didn't make a scene. They didn't shout or confront anyone. They sat silently, which somehow made everything 10 times more powerful. Because the difference between entitlement and necessity was now visible in the space of a single empty rectangle of blue paint. Around minute 25, the first ripple of poetic timing appeared, a patrol car turning into the lot. People didn't cheer, not yet, but shoulders relaxed, eyes focused. Phones stayed recording, and still, she remained inside, totally unaware that she wasn't coming back to the parking space she'd left. She was coming back to a reality she didn't control. This is the part where the story truly shifted. Not when the officer arrived, but right before he stepped out of the car, when everyone silently realized she had just crossed from arrogance into consequences. Because laws don't ask whether you think you're important. Ramps, rails, and permit signs don't bend to ego. Disability access isn't an opinion. It doesn't care if you're just a minute or just entitled. The rule exists because someone, somewhere, will need it every minute of every day. And today, that someone was right there waiting, less than 50 feet away, all because one person believed she was bigger than the law. The irony? If she had just parked like everyone else, no one would have recorded anything. No one would have cared. She would have been invisible, forgettable. Just another face in a crowd running errands. But entitlement always wants to be seen, until it is. By the time the officer opened his door, every witness had the same quiet realization. She wasn't on the HOA board, she was on camera, and the moment she walked back out of that store, she was going to learn that the world doesn't revolve around her clipboard authority, and that I make the rules doesn't work in places where real rules actually matter. It wasn't rage that brought accountability. To her door, it was patience, it was witnesses. It was a disabled person waiting 25 minutes longer than they should have. Most of all, it was the one thing entitlement never sees coming, other people paying attention. The patrol car didn't arrive with sirens or flashing lights. It just eased into the lot like it was part of the scenery, slipping in behind the illegally parked SUV so smoothly that it looked as if it had always been there. The officer stepped out, not rushed, not irritated, not dramatic. Just steady, observant, and professional. He didn't even glance toward the store right away. He just took in the scene. Bright blue paint beneath the SUV, signage posted clear as day, 0 permit, 0 placard, 0 excuse. He started documenting quietly. The slow and methodical way someone does a task they've done 1,000 times and have no emotional investment in. Clipboard, ticket pad, notepad, a quick photo to officially record the violation. His calmness was poetic, like watching justice stroll onto the stage uninvited but right on time. The people standing nearby didn't say a word. They didn't need to. You could practically feel their satisfaction radiating outward like a silent cheer. It wasn't the kind of cheering you hear. At a sports game, it was the kind that lives in raised eyebrows and that tiny victorious breath people let out. When the universe finally decides to balance the scales. 5 more minutes passed, and then right on cue, she walked. Out of the store. She wasn't hurrying, she wasn't apologetic. She wasn't remotely aware that her morning had just rerouted from quick errand to public spectacle. She came out cradling her smoothie like it was a trophy, shopping bag swinging from her wrist with self-satisfied rhythm. The kind of walk you only have when you believe you are, still in control of everything around you, but control is an illusion that lasts, exactly until reality taps you on the shoulder. She saw the uniform first, then the ticket pad, then the patrol. Car behind her SUV. There was a full second, where her brain didn't register it. Just a blank, blinking pause. Then her expression shifted like a fast-mode slideshow. Confidence, confusion, shock, rage that looked like someone had just pulled the earth out from under her. She didn't walk toward the officer. She marched. Stiff shoulders, sharp steps, chin raised in indignation like she was entering a courtroom as her own attorney, expecting the world to bow its head and apologize for daring to challenge her. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing? That's my car!" The way she said "my" sounded less like ownership of a vehicle and more like she believed the spot itself, and apparently the law, belonged to her. The officer didn't flinch. He didn't get defensive. He didn't match her volume. He didn't even look annoyed. He just turned slightly toward her with the kind of calm neutrality that instantly told everyone watching. This was not his first entitled driver of the day. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "this is a disabled parking space. You don't have a placard. This is a citation." There it was. Simple, objective, factual. Not an argument, just the law spoken out loud. But entitlement doesn't process facts first. "It panics. I don't need a placard," she snapped. "I'm on the HOA board. I enforce rules all the time. This is harassment!" She planted that line like it was a trump card, like HOA board member was supposed to operate as some kind of legal shield. Like the officer would suddenly gasp, salute her, apologize for the inconvenience, and drive off. Instead, the officer gave her a look that wasn't angry. It was almost amused, calm to the point of invulnerability. A face that clearly said, "I've seen this exact performance before. Being on an HOA board doesn't exempt you from state law," he replied matter-of-factly. That one sentence landed harder than any argument could have, because it stripped her power away in a single breath. Her title meant nothing here. Her habit of intimidating neighbors meant nothing. Her illusion of authority stopped cold the second it collided with actual authority. Around them, people tried, really tried, not to laugh. But the smothered chuckles, the poorly contained smiles, the quiet exhale of satisfaction were impossible to hide. The bystanders weren't laughing at her parking ticket. They were laughing at the moment her self-appointed superiority finally hit a wall she couldn't push through. She stood there, sputtering, not speechless, but scrambling. People like her aren't used to being told no. They're used to steamrolling over softer voices. But you can't steamroll a law. You can't browbeat a statute. You can't intimidate a peace officer doing his job. She tried again, louder this time, as if increasing the volume might change reality. "You don't understand who I am. I run this community. I work with enforcement. I make rules." The officer didn't even blink. "And you are still required to follow them," he answered calmly. returning his attention to the ticket pad as if she had become background noise. That dismissal, calm, clean, unshakable, hit her far harder than the citation itself. You could see it in the way she recoiled slightly, stunned that someone wasn't caving to her outrage. All her assumed authority evaporated the moment she encountered someone whose jurisdiction didn't end where the property line began. She wasn't arguing from law. She was arguing from ego, and ego doesn't stand a chance against someone who isn't emotionally invested in the argument. She tried changing tactics, not apologizing, not acknowledging fault, but doubling down with self-importance. "I'm just running a quick errand," she snapped. "Why don't you go ticket actual violators instead of harassing a HOA board member trying to do her job?" People didn't have to say a word. Every bystander's expression delivered the same silent message. "This is you doing your job? Blocking disabled access?" The officer paused just long enough to look her in the eye and say, "Ma'am, this is not harassment. This is the law being enforced. The space is designated for disabled drivers with valid permits only." She opened her mouth again, probably to argue, but the officer had already turned back to the citation, which somehow made it 10 times more humiliating. He wasn't debating. He wasn't negotiating. He wasn't even engaged in her tantrum. Her outrage was bouncing off a brick wall because entitlement feeds on reaction. Calm starves it, and the crowd could feel it. She was losing this battle not through force, but through irrelevance. Even funnier, the disabled driver who'd been waiting still hadn't said a word. They just watched quietly, patiently, as the person who took their space tried to turn herself into the victim of her own choices. The recording phones didn't budge. If humiliation had a volume meter, hers was spiking by the second. This wasn't just a ticket. This was a mirror, and she hated what it showed her. The meltdown didn't begin with shouting. It began with disbelief, the kind that turns someone's face stiff before their voice ever rises. She couldn't process that this was actually happening to her, not to a stranger. Not to some nameless resident she usually scolded in bored emails. To her, the self-appointed gatekeeper of neighborhood order. The woman who believed her clipboard authority extended past driveways and mailboxes. Into moral superiority, she stepped closer to the officer, waving the shopping bag like it was proof of innocence, as if a smoothie and a scented candle qualified as a legal defense. Her voice jumped an octave the second she realized the officer wasn't backing down. "You don't understand who I am," she shouted. Words vibrated with panic disguised as power. "I run things in this neighborhood." The officer didn't sigh, didn't blink, didn't flinch. He just delivered a reply so quick and so clean it sliced straight through the theatrics. "But you don't run this parking lot," he said calmly, "and you don't run the law." That one sentence landed harder than anything else said all morning. You could feel it tighten the air. It was like a balloon finally meeting a pin, except the balloon still thought it was armored steel. That moment was when the bystanders collectively shifted from observing to documenting history. Phones came up higher. Some people hit record for the first time. Others had already been filming and simply zoomed in. Someone near the outdoor cafe whispered, barely containing their grin, "This is better than Saturday morning TV." The HOA woman heard it. Oh, she definitely heard it. And instead of stepping back or cooling down, she doubled down in the worst way possible by assuming volume could substitute for legitimacy. She leaned in toward the officer, invading the bubble of professional space he hadn't ceded an inch of. "I told you, I am on the HOA board, and I have every right to—" "You have no right to use a disabled space without a permit," the officer interrupted. Still not raising his voice, still not reacting emotionally. He might as well have been reading instructions off a traffic safety pamphlet. Then, and this was the moment that changed her demeanor completely, he checked a box on his form, pulled out an additional slip and began writing something else. She noticed immediately. "What is that?" she demanded. The officer didn't even look up. "Tow authorization," he said, not dramatic, not threatening, just matter of fact. But to her, it may as well have been the courtroom gavel slamming shut on her ego. Her eyes went wide, not the angry kind, but the "oh no, this is real" kind. She burst into frantic rebuttals, like someone who had rehearsed intimidation her whole life and was now rapidly discovering it had an expiration date. No. No, you can't tow me. I said I'll move it. I'm moving it right now. She fumbled toward her door like she could erase the last half hour by physically grabbing the handle. But the officer didn't budge. Tow is already in progress, ma'am. The words were simple. The meaning was enormous. It was the first time she wasn't the one controlling the outcome. She turned around, searching the crowd for backup. But there was none. The usual fear-compliance effect she was accustomed to inside HOA meetings was gone. No one cowered. No one acted intimidated. No one treated her like a self-anointed authority. If anything, people looked relieved, because this wasn't just about a parking space. It was about the years of petty control she had exercised over everyone. Else finally boomeranging back into her lap, she tried another tactic, the pretend calm. Voice she probably used in board emails. Listen, she said, trying to smooth her tone while still radiating superiority. I work with enforcement. I know how these rules are supposed to be applied. Disabled spots are for when people are crowding, not... That is not accurate. The officer cut in before she could twist policy into fiction. The designation applies at all times, regardless of occupancy. The space is reserved for drivers with legal permits only. He recited it like a script burned into training manuals. Because it was. Her bluff died mid-sentence. Her expression crumpled from persuasion to desperation. She cycled through tactics, the way a malfunctioning vending machine cycles through rejected bills. Authority, intimidation, justification, then bargaining. What if I just pay the fine right now? She tried next. Doesn't change the violation, the officer replied. What if I explain my role in the HOA? Has no legal bearing. Can I speak to your supervisor? The tow authorization is already filed. You'll have access to all appeal information on the citation paperwork. You are not talking your way out of this. That was when the panic finally broke. Through the entitlement and showed itself plainly on her face, her voice wavered. Her certainty evaporated. The hierarchy she relied on, being the one others feared, inverted itself in real time. While she sputtered, the disabled driver she had prevented from parking quietly pulled into the spot the moment the SUV was officially recorded as a tow violation. The community watched the transfer like a ceremony. A rightful space finally being restored to its rightful purpose. No speeches. No dramatic soundtrack. Just a quiet reclaiming of dignity. And then it happened. Something she could never have imagined. The crowd applauded. Not loudly. Not mockingly, just a soft, genuine ripple of relief, like the neighborhood itself exhaled. The applause wasn't for the officer. It wasn't because of punishment. It was for fairness finally landing where it needed to. The HOA woman whipped her head toward the clapping, like she'd been slapped by the sound of justice. It wasn't sympathy she found in their faces, and it was clarity. People weren't afraid of her here. People weren't impressed by her title. People weren't buying the myth she'd built about herself. For once, everyone's empathy was with the person she had inconvenienced, not the person she pretended to protect. The power structure she lived off of had just flipped upside down, not violently but silently, decisively. It wasn't that the community turned against her in that moment. It was that they finally stopped, pretending she was above them and she could feel it. The panic wasn't just about losing her car to the tow yard. It was about losing a throne she thought was permanent. When the tow truck finally rumbled into the plaza, reality hit her harder than any fine ever could. She had been operating under a personal rule book her entire HOA career, a world where she was the one who issued warnings. She set the tone. She controlled the narrative. But this was the first time she discovered what it felt like to stand on the other side of authority, the side she always assumed she'd never fall onto. Her posture changed. The self-importance that once made her movements stiff and rigid had melted into something visibly fragile. She hovered near the SUV like someone hovering beside a closing elevator door, hoping, praying, waiting for a miracle that wasn't coming. But policies don't bend themselves back into shape just because ego bends out of shape. Rules apply even when no one expects them to, especially then. The tow driver barely acknowledged her presence. He didn't treat her like a villain. He treated her like every other illegally parked driver he'd ever towed, which oddly made the moment worse for her. To be treated as ordinary when she had spent years convincing herself she was extraordinary, that was the first real sting. She tried a last-second plea, voice wobbling between indignant and pleading. "Can't you just let me off with a warning?" she asked the officer, clutching at the last thread of imagined leverage. His response landed like a quote destined for the internet's highlight reel. "The warning was painted on the ground before you arrived." The crowd didn't laugh, not immediately. They exhaled. The kind of exhale that comes when someone finally puts a period at the end of a very long and exhausting sentence. The officer wasn't mocking her. He wasn't belittling her. He was simply pointing out the plain truth she had driven right over, literally and symbolically. Once the cable was hooked and the SUV began lifting off its front wheels, the finality sank in. Something in her expression changed. Not anger this time, but recognition. A recognition she couldn't wriggle out of with titles or tone. The SUV was gone within minutes. The plaza, which had felt like her personal stage when she stormed in, no longer belonged to her. She was no longer the center of control. She had become the cautionary tale standing on the curb, watching consequences roll away with her car. But humiliation doesn't need applause to be complete. It completes itself the moment the person realizes there is no reset switch. She stood there, not sure where to look, not sure how to walk back to dignity. The irony was that people didn't jeer. They didn't heckle. They didn't lecture. They let silence do the heavy lifting, because what else was there to say? The moment was already louder than any commentary could be. The internet finished what the sidewalk started. Clips spread fast because people recognized a story they'd lived in small ways. A rule enforcer who never thought the rules applied backward. A person who saw authority as a podium rather than a responsibility. The footage didn't go viral because she was hated. It went viral because she was familiar. Sure enough, word traveled through the neighborhood faster than every HOA policy email she had ever sent. The plaza incident made it to front porches before it hit social media. Parents repeated it to other parents at bus stops. Retirees mentioned it during morning dog walks. Not with spite, with relief. For once, the people who lived under her micromanagement saw a version of her they never expected, accountable. By the time the next HOA meeting arrived, the atmosphere was different. The room wasn't filled with the usual quiet compliance. Instead, it was filled with a kind of collective patience, like the neighborhood had finally realized they were allowed to question the microphone instead of just listening to it. She walked into the meeting slightly smaller than usual, not physically, but emotionally. There was no grand entrance, no posture of superiority. Just a sense that the pedestal she'd put herself on had quietly crumbled from under her feet. Several residents who had never once dared speak up suddenly found their voice, not to attack, but to challenge the belief that title equals immunity. They asked the question that had been sitting in the community for years, but had never been safely spoken aloud. If board members expect residents to follow rules, shouldn't they be the first to model them? That was when she realized the real consequence wasn't the tow. It wasn't the fine. It wasn't even the viral video. The real consequence was losing credibility, the one currency someone in her position can't function without. Leadership doesn't survive long when people stop recognizing the leader. Respect, once lost, doesn't rewind itself. The board scheduled a formal review of her conduct, something she had once weaponized against others. Now turned back toward her with the same procedural seriousness she thought she'd never face personally. She called it unfair. But fair had finally caught up to her, not because anyone targeted her, but because fairness isn't selective. It just waited its turn. The person who truly anchored the shift wasn't the crowd or the officer or the tow driver. It was the disabled woman who had waited quietly for the spot, the one whose needs were invisible under the board member's assumption of self-importance. When she finally got to use the spot, there was no speech, no anger, no gloating. She simply parked, gathered her things, and went about her day with grace. That contrast said everything. The HOA woman had been loud with entitlement. The disabled woman was silent with purpose. One had seen the parking space as a convenience. The other saw it for what it truly was: access, independence, dignity, because some paint on asphalt isn't just paint. It is a promise that those who need help don't have to beg for it. It is a safeguard for mobility, for safety, for freedom, not a reserved VIP lane for whoever feels important that morning. And that difference is where the story found its weight. The viral clip wasn't just about a tow truck or an argument. People shared it because it was accountability in real time, not delivered harshly, not delivered cruelly, but delivered cleanly and fairly. It was a reminder that oversight means nothing if the overseer exempts themselves from the same standards. Authority without integrity is just theatrics. The moment she treated the space like a prop in her personal power display, she was no longer a board member. She was just another person breaking rules she expected others to obey. She didn't just lose her car for the afternoon. She lost the illusion that she was untouchable. And in a way, that was the first time the community ever saw her as equal, not above them, not beyond them, not sheltered by her title, just accountable like everyone else. And that is why, weeks later, the video still circulates. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is universal. We've all met someone who thinks rules are decorative until they inconvenience them. We've all seen people who hide behind titles rather than uphold them. We've all watched someone learn the difference between power and responsibility. The hard way. The internet didn't make her infamous. Consequences did. That's why the clip still resonates, not because of the punishment, but because humility finally parked where entitlement tried to.